The war between Germany and Russia, known to history as the Eastern Front of the Second World War, was not merely a clash of armies. It was a collision of ideologies, empires, and destinies that reshaped the modern world. From the frozen forests of Finland to the burning ruins of Stalingrad, this colossal struggle became the bloodiest conflict humanity has ever witnessed. More soldiers and civilians died here than in all other theaters of World War II combined. To understand how this war unfolded, one must begin not with the first shot fired in 1941, but decades earlier, in the ashes of empires and the rise of radical visions for the future. At the end of the First World War, Germany lay humiliated and broken. The Treaty of Versailles stripped it of territory, military power, and national pride. Many Germans felt betrayed, believing their nation had been stabbed in the back rather than defeated on the battlefield. Economic collapse, political instability, and social unrest followed. Amid this chaos, extremist ideologies flourished. One of them was National Socialism, led by a man who would soon plunge Europe into catastrophe, Adolf Hitler. To the east, Russia had undergone its own violent transformation. The Russian Empire collapsed during World War I, giving birth to the Soviet Union after a brutal civil war. Under Vladimir Lenin and later Joseph Stalin, the Soviet state embraced communism, rejected capitalism, and sought to build a new society through centralized control and industrialization. While the Soviet Union survived its early years, it did so at immense human cost. Famines, purges, labor camps, and repression became defining features of Stalin's rule. From the beginning, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union viewed each other with deep suspicion and hatred. Hitler despised communism, seeing it as a Jewish conspiracy that threatened Aryan civilization. He believed Germany's future lay in the East, in vast lands that could be conquered, colonized, and exploited. This concept, known as Lebensraum, or living space, was central to Nazi ideology. According to Hitler, Germany had a historic mission to destroy the Soviet Union, enslave its people, and claim its resources. Stalin, on the other hand, distrusted Nazi Germany, but initially sought to avoid direct conflict. The Soviet Union was still recovering from internal purges that had decimated its military leadership. Tens of thousands of officers had been executed or imprisoned, leaving the Red Army weakened and inexperienced. Stalin knew war with Germany was inevitable, but he wanted time. In August 1939, the world was stunned when Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, it was a non-aggression treaty. Secretly, it divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be carved up. The Baltic states would fall under Soviet control. For Hitler, the pact ensured that Germany could invade Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. For Stalin, it bought precious time and territorial expansion. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union attacked from the east. Poland was crushed, and World War II began. While Germany turned west to fight France and Britain, the Soviet Union expanded its borders, occupying eastern Poland, annexing the Baltic states, and fighting a brutal war against Finland. On the surface, Berlin and Moscow appeared to be uneasy partners. Beneath the surface, both sides were preparing for betrayal. By 1940, Germany stood victorious across much of Europe. France had fallen. The Low Countries were occupied. Britain stood alone, but unbroken. Hitler now turned his gaze eastward. He believed the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse with one strong blow. He underestimated Soviet manpower, industrial potential, and resilience. He also believed time was critical. Germany needed Soviet oil, grain, and resources to sustain a long war. Planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union began in secret. The operation was given a name that would echo through history: Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. It was the largest military invasion ever planned. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by hundreds of thousands of Axis allies from Romania, Hungary, Finland, and Italy, would strike across a front stretching more than 2,900 kilometers. The plan was based on speed and destruction. German generals believed that if they could encircle and annihilate Soviet armies near the border, the Soviet state would collapse within weeks. Moscow, Leningrad, and Ukraine were primary objectives. The campaign was expected to end before winter. Supplies, clothing, and long-term planning reflected this dangerous assumption. Meanwhile, intelligence warnings poured into Moscow. Soviet spies, foreign governments, and even German defectors warned Stalin that an invasion was imminent. Yet Stalin refused to believe it. He feared provocation and believed Hitler would not risk a two-front war while Britain still resisted. As a result, Soviet forces along the border were caught unprepared, poorly positioned, and under strict orders not to provoke the Germans. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, the silence of the eastern frontier was shattered. Without a declaration of war, German artillery opened fire, bombers struck Soviet airfields, panzer divisions surged forward. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The ground shook as the largest invasion force in history crossed into Soviet territory. German forces advanced with terrifying speed. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled and destroyed. Thousands of aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Cities fell one after another. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the opening months. To the German leadership, it seemed their assumptions had been correct. The Soviet Union appeared on the verge of collapse. But beneath the surface, a different reality was forming. The vastness of Soviet territory, the resilience of its people, and the brutality of German occupation would soon transform this war into something far darker and far more destructive than anyone in Berlin had imagined. What began as a campaign of conquest would become a war of annihilation, one that consumed soldiers and civilians alike, reshaped nations, and decided the fate of the 20th century. As dawn broke on June 22, 1941, the Soviet Union awoke to a nightmare unfolding across its western frontier. German artillery thundered relentlessly, tearing through defensive positions that had never been fully prepared for war. Luftwaffe bombers roared overhead, striking Soviet airfields with devastating precision. Within hours, thousands of Soviet aircraft lay destroyed on the ground, their pilots killed or scattered before they could even take off. The surprise was total. Operation Barbarossa had achieved its first and critical objective: shock. Along the vast invasion front, German forces advanced in 3 massive army groups, each assigned a strategic objective. Army Group North surged towards Leningrad through the Baltic states. Army Group Center, the strongest formation, drove straight towards Moscow. Army Group South thundered into Ukraine, targeting fertile farmland, coal, and oil. Supporting them were hundreds of thousands of Axis troops from Romania, Hungary, Finland, and Slovakia, turning the invasion into a multinational assault on Soviet territory. German blitzkrieg tactics worked with horrifying efficiency. Panzer divisions pierced Soviet lines, racing deep into the rear while infantry closed the gaps behind them. Entire Soviet armies were encircled in massive cauldrons. At Bialystok in Minsk, hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were trapped. Most were killed or captured. The roads became rivers of refugees, soldiers without weapons, civilians fleeing in terror, and wounded men crawling through the dust. Soviet command and control collapsed in the opening weeks. Communications were cut, officers were killed, and units fought blindly without orders. Many Soviet soldiers had never seen combat before. Some didn't even know war had begun. Others fought desperately, launching counterattacks with outdated equipment and little coordination. Their bravery was undeniable, but it was crushed beneath German firepower and experience. By July 1941, German forces had advanced hundreds of kilometers. Minsk had fallen, Smolensk was under threat. The German high command believed victory was within reach. Hitler declared that the Soviet Union had been fatally wounded. Plans were already being drawn for post-war colonization, the extermination or enslavement of millions, and the permanent German domination of Eastern Europe. Yet despite catastrophic losses, the Soviet Union did not collapse. Instead, it began to absorb the blow. Deep within the Soviet interior, factories were dismantled and transported east beyond the Ural Mountains. Entire industrial cities were rebuilt in weeks. Workers labored day and night, often in freezing conditions, producing tanks, aircraft, and weapons in staggering numbers. Women, teenagers, and even children replaced men who had gone to the front. Stalin, shaken by the scale of the invasion, initially retreated into silence. For several days, he vanished from public view, fearing betrayal and collapse. But when he returned, he addressed the nation with a message that framed the war not just as a defense of socialism, but as a great patriotic war for the survival of the Russian people themselves. This appeal to history, identity, and homeland ignited a fierce resolve across the Soviet population. Meanwhile, German occupation policies began to sow the seeds of disaster. Instead of liberators, German troops became instruments of terror. Jewish populations were massacred by Einsatzgruppen. Villages were burned. Civilians were starved, enslaved, or executed. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were deliberately left to die of hunger and exposure. This brutality eliminated any chance of winning local support and turned the conflict into a war of absolute hatred. In the north, Army Group North pushed relentlessly toward Leningrad. By September 1941, the city was surrounded. Rather than storm it, Hitler ordered a blockade. What followed was one of the longest and most horrific sieges in history. Cut off from food, fuel, and supplies, Leningrad's population faced starvation, cold, and constant bombardment. Over 1 million civilians would die, yet the city refused to surrender. In the center, Army Group Center reached the outskirts of Smolensk. Here, the first signs of German overconfidence emerged. Soviet resistance stiffened, counterattacks became more coordinated, German supply lines stretched dangerously thin, panzer divisions slowed, infantry lagged behind. The vast distances of the Soviet Union began to devour the momentum of blitzkrieg. To the south, the battle for Ukraine erupted with immense ferocity. The Germans sought to seize Kyiv, one of the Soviet Union's most important cities. After weeks of maneuvering, they executed one of the largest encirclements in history. In September 1941, over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured near Kyiv. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Red Army, but also a costly delay for Germany. That delay would prove fatal. As summer turned to autumn, Hitler faced a critical decision: continue the drive on Moscow or divert forces to secure Ukraine and Leningrad. Against the advice of many generals, he chose to divert. Panzer units were redirected south, the push toward Moscow stalled, precious weeks were lost. By October 1941, the Germans resumed their advance toward Moscow in Operation Typhoon. The weather turned against them. Autumn rains transformed roads into seas of mud, vehicles sank, horses died, supply columns fell apart. Still, German troops pressed on, reaching within sight of the Kremlin. Panic gripped Moscow. Government offices were evacuated. Factories were dismantled. Defensive lines were hastily constructed by civilians, students, and workers. Yet the Red Army was no longer the shattered force of June. Fresh divisions arrived from Siberia, hardened troops trained for winter warfare. Soviet intelligence had confirmed that Japan would not attack from the east, allowing Stalin to redeploy these elite forces westward. As temperatures plunged and German troops froze in summer uniforms, the balance began to shift. In December 1941, the unimaginable happened. The Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive outside Moscow. German lines broke. Exhausted and unprepared for winter, German units were driven back. For the first time in the war, the myth of German invincibility was shattered. The Lightning War had failed. The war between Germany and Russia had entered a new phase, one of endurance, annihilation, and total mobilization. What was meant to be a quick campaign had become a brutal struggle for survival, and far worse was yet to come.